Alright, so today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite types of snakes, king snakes. I currently have 6 different snakes in the Lamprepeltis genus. Lamprepeltis, I think that's how you say it. I don't know how else you would say it. Scientific names are weird. I have a speckled king snake, a Mexican black king snake, a Florida king snake, a California king snake, a Puebloan milk snake, and a Nelson's milk snake. I also included the milk snakes since they're in the same genus. So for an enclosure size with these snakes, I would stick to something around a 4x2x2 as an adult. It's not a bad idea to go bigger, especially with some of these species that'll get bigger. My California king snake right now is in a 4x2x2, and it seems to work just right. It's plenty of space for him. He utilizes every corner of the enclosure, and he seems to be fairly comfortable in this size of an enclosure. Now you can put a juvenile snake or a baby snake in an enclosure that will be its forever home. But keep in mind with a bigger space like this, you want to make sure it feels secure for the animal, so just add plenty of hides and really fill the space up. Many species of king snakes, like my California king snake for example, are pretty diurnal and very active. So they'll utilize this space all throughout the day and throughout the night sometimes. Now you'll want to look up your specific species that you're going to get before you actually get the animal and figure out what the average length is that they'll be as an adult. As a rule of thumb, and this is a pretty loose rule, but I like to put my snakes in an enclosure that's at least the longest that the snake will be as an adult. When it comes to what type of enclosure you want to put your snake in, I really prefer these PVC enclosures. I only have one of these right now, but these are very lightweight. They're easy to put together. They have sliding glass doors, so you're not reaching in from the top and spooking the animal as much. And I like how they have a dark background. This might help the animal feel a little more secure. These also have vents on the side. My California king snake and my Florida king snake are two species that I will have in at least a 4x2x2 as an adult. Now if you have an enclosure that has a screen top, you want to make sure you have clips on the lid so the animal can't get out. If there's even the smallest area where the snake might be able to get out, they'll find that area. Dubia also has locks available for these PVC enclosures so you can lock the handles and the snake can't slide the door. Also, if you have a screen top type of an enclosure, make sure that you don't have a lot of stuff on the top so the ventilation is good. Alright, so when it comes to substrate, I like to use a mix of about 60% soil, 20% clay, and 20% sand for most of my species. Now, depending on the species and what kind of humidity they'll need, you might add 20% moss instead of sand or instead of clay. For my soil, I use Terra Firma or Terra Sahara by the Biodude. I have noticed that the Terra Firma has quite a bit of wood in it, and eventually when you spray down your enclosure, this wood kind of rises to the top and it makes the plants a little less steady and harder for the roots to take hold. So that's why I prefer the Terra Sahara, at least in my experience. You can use other organic soils as long as they don't have a lot of additives and random ingredients. For how much you want to add, so for a 40 gallon or a 4x2x2, I like to shoot for around 4 to 5 inches at least. But keep in mind, if you add 4 or 5 inches of loose soil, sand, and clay, as you spray down the enclosure and as the animals move around, this will get packed down quite a bit. So if you're going for a permanent depth of 4 to 5 inches, you might actually add 6 inches of soil. Before I add my soil, I like to add about a cup of water into the bag and mix it up. This just prevents the soil from drying out faster. This can happen if you go several days without spraying in the enclosure. Now, some people use aspen, which can be okay if you have no other option. Aspen holds burrows really well and it's easy to spot the poops. I started out by using a lot of aspen, and when I did have my king snakes on aspen, many times they would have issues with shedding. You don't want to spray down aspen a lot with water because it can get moldy and it goes bad and you just have to change it more often. And nobody wants to see their snake having issues with shedding, though it does happen regardless of whether you have bioactive substrates or not. 99% of the time, my snakes shed in one complete piece with the soil mix. But for the most part, if you do have a soil, sand, and clay mix, I would recommend just going ahead and going bioactive. Most of my enclosures are bioactive with plants, isopods, and springtails, and without a cleanup crew, you might have to change this fairly often like you would with aspen. When you add in your mix, especially if you're going bioactive, mix in a bunch of leaves. These are good for the isopods, the springtails, and the plants. And it also creates layers and different pockets of air and humidity, which is beneficial for your snake, for the plants, and everything in the enclosure. Adding some charcoal is also not a bad idea. You can also add little microclimates in your enclosure if you have a bioactive soil. You can add a little patch of sphagnum moss, for example. Maybe a little 6x6 patch with sphagnum moss and then cork bark over the top of it. The isopods will love this. Now, for the soil to really retain burrows, retain humidity, and be as effective as it can be, I would recommend spraying your enclosure down every 1 to 2 days, maybe more often, maybe not as often, depending on the needs of both your animal, the isopods and springtails, and your plant. And it takes a little bit of balancing and practice to figure out how to get it fine-tuned. If you get the bioactive substrate by the BioDude, it also comes with a little packet of BioShot that they have available, and this is kind of a Kickstarter for your soil. I'd recommend adding maybe a ½ inch of leaves to the top of your soil, and as you add in these layers, you want to spray each layer to where it's damp but not dripping wet. Also, if you add too much water and it just gets stagnant in your enclosure, this can cause root rot and your plants can actually die off because of this, so you don't want to add too much water. Now let's talk about hides. In a 4x2x2 setup or even a 40-gallon, I would recommend adding at least 3 different hides. You want to add one hide on the warm side, one hide on the cool side, and at least one other kind of somewhere in the middle. This gives your snake options to hide in different temperature gradients and in different humidity gradients. You want to add hides to your enclosure that the snake will feel secure in, but not too small. This is another thing that you just kind of have to play around with and figure out what works just right for your individual animal. I have several hides in my California kingsnakes enclosure. A couple of them are very snug, a couple of them not so much. But if there's too much space in the hide, the animal might not feel as safe. I also kind of like to bury my hides, so I leave just enough of an opening for the snake to slide in and out. And I like to cover the edges and the outside of the hide so that there's not a lot of light coming into the hide. Also, if you have a planted enclosure, it's not a bad idea to place one of the plants at the front opening of a hide. That way the leaves can kind of spread out and cover the hide, and it's kind of a natural hide for your snake. If you go bioactive and you're adding plants, I highly recommend pothos. Also, I've had good luck with corn plants and spider plants. These plants seem a little more hardy, and you want a sturdy plant that your snake's not going to just trample and kill. This is another thing that you'll kind of have to balance with what your humidity needs to be, not only for your snake, but for the isopods and springtails. If you need a plant that only needs watered once a week, but your humidity needs to be higher in the enclosure, this might take some playing around with. With my pothos, my spider plants, and my corn plants, for the most part, I water them about every other day and spray the enclosure down every other day. And this keeps a good humidity not only for the plants, but the isopods and the springtails are thriving, and the snake is healthy and has good sheds. One issue I faced when I first started adding plants to my enclosure is they really didn't seem to have roots that would take hold very easily. And I've learned that if you have pretty damp soil around the plant, and if you really pack that down, it just makes it become more sturdy and the roots can really take hold. Snakes might burrow and mess this up a little bit, so you want to check this multiple times a week and make sure that that soil is packed down and the roots can really take hold. One thing that I've noticed seems to make pretty good fertilizer for plants is the old snake water. Whenever I change my snake water once or twice a week, I'll dump some of it on my plants and they seem to really thrive from this. Also, the old crunched up leaves and moss creates good pockets of humidity and good fertilizer for the plants. So for isopods with the kingsnake's enclosure, I would go with something like powder orange or powder blue. These seem to really thrive in different temperature and humidity gradients. You could also go with something like dairy cow isopods. They're really good to clean up big messes. But sometimes they thrive almost too much and you'll end up with a lot of dairy cow isopods, like most isopods, but they can be a little more protein hungry. I have dairy cow isopods with some of my corn snakes right now, and they seem to do just fine. They don't seem to bother the corn snakes, and they're very good for cleanup crew. I started my California kingsnake out with about 24 powder blue isopods. Right now, I'd say there's close to 200 or more powder blue, and that's after about 6 months of having a bioactive enclosure. The powder blue thrive in every temperature gradient and humidity gradient in this enclosure. If I could go back, I would probably get powder orange, but I just like that color better. So I'd start out with around 24 to 36 isopods in a 4x2x2 or even in a 40-gallon. For your springtails, add maybe 1 to 200 springtails and go from there. I like to add my springtails around the water bowl, and when I change my water dish, I spray the water bowl around the edge and it keeps it humid underneath there, and the springtails seem to really thrive underneath that water bowl. You also want to make sure you have plenty of leaves and a good layer of leaves over the top of your soil. The isopods will eat these leaves as they rot, so it provides not only food for the isopods, but also hiding spaces. When it comes to feeding isopods and springtails, a lot of the leaves, wood, and urates or poop that's left in your enclosure they will eat. But I like to supplement their diet with slices of carrot, sweet potato, dried shrimp, or ground up eggshells about once every week or two. Also, if you add snake sheds to your enclosure, or if you just leave the snake sheds and there's a lot of isopods in that enclosure, they'll eat the snake shed. For some reason, they don't eat the belly scales, which is kind of weird. If somebody knows anything about that, let me know in the comments. But if you have a bunch of isopods in your enclosure and you add a snake shed, they'll destroy that thing overnight. Also, on the sides of your water bowl, make sure you don't have too many leaves or things that the isopods can climb on because they will drown themselves. And it makes your water go bad pretty fast, and obviously, That's sad for the isopods. This might make it difficult to keep up a population, especially starting out, if your isopods are just running into the water bowl and, unaliving themselves. So one way to help your isopods thrive is by adding a big piece of cork bark to the enclosure. You can get cork flats online or in pet stores, and these not only provide hiding opportunities for your isopods and your springtails, but it's also food for the isopods. So now let's talk about heating and lighting. When it comes to how hot you want your hotspot to be, I stick to around 90 degrees for most of my kingsnake. I keep the warm side at an ambient temperature of about 80 to 85, and then the cool side stays around room temperature, so maybe 70 to 75 degrees. Overnight it might drop down to as cool as 65. And with a bigger enclosure, you have more options for creating a better gradient. For what type of heat bulb you want to use, I prefer halogens. Now, if you have a bigger snake and you want to create a bigger hotspot, you might add a halogen and a DP projector, or two halogens. I like to have a halogen and a DP projector on during the day, and then at night I have my halogen turned off, and the DP projector stays on for 2 or 3 hours so the more nocturnal snakes can come out and warm up. Just keep in mind, you don't want any kind of visible light on during the night so the snake has a good day-night cycle. I stick with halogens because they produce more IRA and IRB, which is the strongest forms of infrared heat, compared to a ceramic heat emitter or a heat mat, which mostly produce IRC and it doesn't really penetrate the skin as well. When it comes to the wattage, it just kind of depends on the enclosure, and you'll have to want to mess around with this a little bit before you actually introduce your snake to the enclosure. You want to make sure you get that hot spot just right before you actually introduce your snake to the enclosure to make sure it's safe. I would check this for at least 24 hours before introducing your snake. You can check this with a temperature gun. So if you have a thermostat set up, usually the thermostat's separate from the heat mat or separate from the heat bulb that you're using. So you want to plug that heat bulb or heat mat into your thermostat. You plug the thermostat into your outlet, and then the probe goes where the heat source will be touching. You can either add the probe between your heat mat and the bottom of your enclosure, or you can tape it down or silicone it down to the inside of the enclosure above where the heat source will be. So if you have a thermostat hooked up with the probe where the heat source is going to be, and you want it to be set at 90 degrees, for example, you set this thermostat to 90 degrees. Once it reaches 90 degrees, it turns off, it cools down a few degrees, and then it kicks back on. But that turning off and on is probably going to wear down the bulb pretty fast. And if you're using this with a halogen, when it comes on and off, that might actually scare off your snake. Some might argue that it might be more natural with clouds going by or whatever, but I guess it kind of depends on how often it's turning on and off. I like to just get a certain wattage of a heat bulb and then dim that to wherever it needs to be. And if I change my thermostat in my house, then I adjust that dimmer or I change the wattage of the bulb. I've never had an issue with this. The only thing I've had issues with is a heat mat getting too hot. These can get pretty out of control pretty fast. I like to put some slate rock below that spot, so it's a more natural source of heat that the animal can lay under and warm up. These slate rocks seem to absorb heat pretty well. I've had pretty good luck using maybe 60 to 75 watt halogen. It stays at a fairly consistent temperature between 85 and 90 degrees. Sometimes this might get a little bit above that, around 92 to 95, but I've never had any issues with this getting too hot, like 100 or more degrees. With a heat mat, on the other hand, I've had a couple of instances when the heat mat got way above 100 degrees. If that probe gets moved a little bit, that heat mat keeps running, and those things can get dangerously hot. But with a certain wattage of a halogen, it's only going to get to a certain temperature. That's why I would recommend for at least 24 hours checking this with a temperature gun, making sure that bulb doesn't fluctuate too much. I also check this at least once or twice a week to make sure that that heat is staying where it needs to be. I just talked to somebody recently that actually had a heat mat that got too out of control. The probe got misplaced, the heat mat got way too hot, cracked the enclosure, and the snake actually got out. Now that sounds like a nightmare. It sounds like something that's not even real, but it happened. The only time I've had a case of my heat source getting too hot was when I used a heat mat. Never with the halogen, never with a deep heat projector, and never with a ceramic heat emitter. If you have a more nocturnal animal, you can put a deep heat projector on during the night. This doesn't emit any light, and it has more IRA or IRB. Now, if you have plenty of room light available, you could use something like a deep heat projector or a ceramic heat emitter during the day, and that wouldn't be as much of an issue. When it comes to UVB, though most people say king snakes don't need UVB, more and more people are coming out and saying that it might be beneficial for your snake, and it's natural, so why not? I recommend the Arcadia Shade Dwellers. These can get pretty expensive, but in my opinion, they're worth it. You can research which Ferguson zone your animal is in and what kind of UVB they actually need. Then you can place a solar meter underneath that UVB where your animal will be basking and figure out exactly how much UVB is getting to that animal. For plant lights, you have a couple of different options, so I've enjoyed using the plant lights that the BioDude has available. You can use either a T5 type of fluorescent light bulb or an LED. LEDs can be a little more expensive, but they're probably more effective. Arcadia also has some really awesome smart LEDs that are available. Now, if you're placing your lights and your heat above the screen top, keep in mind that that'll reduce the amount of actual heat and light that's coming through. Now, if you use a solar meter and you determine that the screen is cutting off too much of your UVB, you can mount your lights on the inside of the enclosure. Snakes move all around the enclosure and they will hurt themselves if that bulb is just completely exposed. So it goes without saying, you want to make sure there's a cage around that bulb that your snake cannot get inside. Also, another random thing that I'll mention is if you have an enclosure right next to a window, make sure you have some blinds or something that's protecting that enclosure from direct sunlight. Sunlight can really heat up your enclosure and this can be dangerous. If you don't have thermostats hooked up in your enclosure, make sure that you're adjusting your temperatures as you adjust the thermostat in your house. Also, just don't use heat rocks. These heat rocks are bad. I'm just going to add that in there real quick. So for a good day-night cycle, if you have multiple snakes, it makes it a lot easier to get a digital timer. Some of these timers you can get for $20 or $30, and they actually have an app where you can run when the timer turns on and off. And it's just automatic, so you don't have to constantly have to be trying to remember to come in and turn it off and off. These old style manual analog timers, or whatever they're called, with the buttons that you push up and down, things happen and the buttons get pushed on accident and the timing is off and sometimes they click really loudly. I just don't recommend these. Though it does seem like sometimes they last longer, I just prefer the digital timer. Now, some of these cheaper timers, like the ones you can get at Walmart, they're only about $10 or $20. But in my experience, these will last about a year or two before they stop working. But with multiple snakes, timers are definitely worth it. You'll want to set these timers to where the heat and the lights turning off around the time it's sunset and then turning back on whenever the sun comes up, and it's a little more natural. And it really lines up that way to where the natural light's coming in through your house at the same time. Many companies have options now for lights that will actually dim down as the sun is going down and dim up as the sun rises. Obviously, this is just next level. You don't have to get these, but I love seeing this technology improve, and I recommend these if you have the money for it. For water and humidity, I would start off by getting a digital humidity gauge. These older style humidity gauges can be alright, but I've noticed a lot of times they're just not effective and they're just on a random number. You can get digital humidity gauges in a pack on Amazon, and while these are cheap, they work pretty well. Now, I will say if you get the really cheap ones, sometimes they don't last as long, whether that's from them getting too wet or whatever the reason is. But they're cheap, so you can just replace them, right? I guess. For humidity, it just depends on your specific animal. Like a Florida kingsnake might have a higher humidity environment than a Mexican black kingsnake or a California kingsnake. So look up the specific range where these animals are found in the wild and then go from there. So if you have a snake that's more tropical, you might want to add more tropical species of isopods, springtails, and plants. That way when it's time to water your plant, your isopods and springtails might also need water and your snake, and it all works together. Also remember that heat holds humidity better than the cold. Usually I spray my cool side more than I do the warm side. That's where I have my little microclimates with moss. That's where my isopods a lot of the times will thrive. I might keep these microclimates maintained a little more than I do the overall enclosure. I spray them almost every day to make sure it's humid and that the isopods have that available. Having these higher humidity spikes really helps your snakes shed. I have 18 snakes and almost every single one of them sheds in one perfect piece every time. And I know a big reason why is because I'm spraying these enclosures down. I'm creating these humidity spikes throughout the week, and the snakes have a more accurate humidity to what they would be experiencing in the wild. This helps avoid stuck shed, and then you won't have to buy products like Sheddies. Sorry, Sheddies, whoever makes that. I'm not trying to hurt your business, but hey, I don't want to have to use it. If you have a specific king snake that's found in a more dry environment, you also might add a humidity box. You can add a Tupperware box with a hole in it and some damp moss on the inside so that snake can crawl in there and get humid whenever it's trying to shed. But with my king snakes that have a more humid environment, I like to add 60% soil, 20% sand, and then about 20% sphagnum moss mixed in, and it really retains humidity and they never have issues with shedding. I would get a water bowl that's at least big enough for your snake to completely curl up in. If you use tap water for your animal, add in some kind of tap water conditioner. For a conditioner like this one, it recommends adding 2 drops for every 8 ounces of water. And I personally like to change my water twice a week. I used to only change it once every week or two, but it gets pretty slimy and grimy pretty quick. I see my snakes drinking their water most often when it's been changed within the last 24 hours, and even more often within the first hour or two after I change it. I like to just keep a habit of changing the water sometime throughout the middle of the week, And then on the weekends when I'm feeding my snakes, I change it at that same time, and a lot of times right after they eat, they'll get a drink. For handling, this also kind of depends on the species. So if I see my snakes out and about and very active during the day, I might remove them from the enclosure and handle them because they're already out and they're exploring. And if you dig them up, especially in a bioactive enclosure, you might mess up your plant roots, you might mess up the burrows that your snake has made. And so this is a tough thing about using a bioactive enclosure rather than just aspen or wood chips or whatever else. Some of these species can be a bit bitey. I feel like this isn't as bad whenever you handle them more often, like at least once or twice a week. My California kingsnake, for example, used to be pretty bitey. If he found the tip of my finger, he would bite it. But over time, he's kind of gotten over this. And my Florida kingsnake, as another example, used to be very calm and would never bite for the first 2 years. And suddenly after that, she was going crazy, very food driven, always looking around and exploring, and was ready to fight pretty much anytime I took her out. So it kind of depends on their age, and it kind of depends on the individual animal. Also keep in mind, if you have multiple snakes, king snakes do eat other snakes. So if you've handled one king snake, and you immediately go and grab another king snake, that king snake might smell the previous king snake on your hand and bite you. So when you're handling multiple snakes, make sure you wash your hands in between each one. If you do get bitten by your king snake, just stay as calm as you can. Don't start throwing things, especially if it's the first time you've been bitten. It can be kind of scary. But one thing I've tried to do is just lay the snake down on the ground, make it feel like it's free to go, and sometimes they'll just let go and they'll move on. You can also run a little bit of water over the snake. The last resort I would use is trying to pry the snake off. You don't want to hurt the animal. Out of my king snakes that I have, my Mexican black king snake is very handleable. My speckled king snake is very handleable. Those are two species that I have that have never tried to bite me once. My Cali king has bitten me several times. My Florida king has tried to bite me several times. Puebloan milk snake has never tried to bite me. So let's talk about feeding. When it comes to feeding my king snakes, for the first year or two, I feed them every 5 to 7 days. The prey items that I feed my snakes are about 1 to 1.5 times the widest point of the snake's body. And when the snake reaches its adult size, I feed them about every 2 to 3 weeks. When your snake is an adult, you want to avoid feeding it more than every 2 weeks or so because snakes can become overweight and obese, and this can shorten their life. So as a juvenile or a baby snake, I feed them every 5 to 7 days. After a year or two, every 7 to 10 days, and after 2, 3, 4 years, I start getting to where I'm feeding them every 2 or 3 weeks. I prefer to feed frozen thawed rodents, but you can also use reptilinks. Using frozen thawed is just safer for the animal. If you throw in a live mouse in your king snake's enclosure and then you just walk off, that mouse can hurt your snake. I've seen it happen before, not with mine personally, but from other people's experience. But it does happen. When it's time for feeding, I usually like to place the rodents in the fridge overnight and let them thaw out that way. And then before I feed them the next day, I put them in some warm water and let them warm up. When I add them to the water, I make sure they're in a sealed bag and there's not water getting on the inside on the rodent. And if any water does, I like to dry them out and make sure it's not really wet whenever I take them out and feed the animal. Most of the time in the wild, if your king snake comes across a rodent, it's not going to be just soaking wet. Now there is an argument about whether you should feed your snake in or out of the enclosure. I've noticed with some of my reptiles it doesn't really matter, and with a couple of them they do seem a little more bitey. If I always feed them in their enclosure and then I go to handle them, they might try to bite me immediately when I open the enclosure. So I think sometimes it just depends on the individual animal and you have to figure out what works best for them. Now if you try feeding your snake in the enclosure and it doesn't take it, I would just try again in 5 to 7 days. There's also an argument that if you take your animal out of your enclosure that it won't eat, and that's completely true. Sometimes if you take the animal out of the enclosure to feed it, it stresses it out to the point where it's not focused on eating at all. But if it's safe and secure in the enclosure and a rodent comes up to it, they still have that focus and not as much stress and they will eat. Many times just so I can handle my snakes, check them out and make sure they're okay and there's nothing wrong with them health-wise, I will pull them out of the enclosure. I'll put them in a tent. I'll feed them in that tent and then I'll put them back in the enclosure. There is an argument about whether or not this can cause the snake to regurgitate. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but with my 18 snakes over the last several years, I've never had it happen once. I pull my snakes out all the time before I feed them. And I'm not saying this is what's going to work best for you. It just goes back to me saying depends on the individual animal. So after you feed your snake, I would leave it alone for at least 2 or 3 days. That allows the snake to really digest the prey item. And then after 2 or 3 days, give or take a few depending on the species and how big it is, you'll see poop in the enclosure, and then after that it's probably a pretty good sign that you can handle the snake. If you do handle your snake 1 or 2 days after, just keep in mind it might poop on you. It happens. Many times after a snake eats, it will hide for a day or two and digest its food and then come back out and warm up. This is a good sign that it doesn't want to be messed with. Not that it ever wants to be messed with in the first place, but I would just leave them alone for a couple days after you feed. Just because your snake is super active and slithering all over the place throughout the day and the night, it doesn't necessarily mean it's hungry. Some of my king snakes are very active and they will do this after only 2 or 3 days after their last meal. My Cali King and my Florida King, actually most of my king snakes, after 2 or 3 days of eating, they're already super active and all over the enclosure. This doesn't necessarily mean that they need more food. This is a way that many people probably overfeed their snakes and they end up becoming obese or fat. Going back to where your specific species is from, they might have different prey items. You might be able to feed your snake quail and have good luck with that, baby chicks, or quail eggs. So for enrichment, this kind of goes back to what size of enclosure you have. If you have a very active snake that really uses every bit of space it has in a 4x2x2, you want to add plenty of climbing opportunities, whether this is branches or artificial branches, or even vines, plants, wood, hides, different objects you put in the enclosure. These snakes will climb and they'll use that. In my California king snake enclosure, I have several branches in there. I have some branches leading up to a hammock where the snake likes to go up and hang out sometimes. And this is just more stimulating and provides more enrichment for your snake. Another thing regarding enrichment, I like to keep a few of the hides and some of the objects in my enclosure permanently in there. And then some of them I kind of switch out depending on what the animal is utilizing the most. If my snake seems to stay in one hide more than the other, I might change that other hide into something else that it might feel more comfortable in. So usually about once a month I take out or add something to the enclosure that is new to the animal. Other things to think about with keeping king snakes. So one thing is lifespan for sure. Some of these king snakes can live 20 to 30 years, give or take a few. So you want to think about the weekly commitment that you're making with these animals. Especially if you have multiple snakes, it's going to take some time to take care of these animals when it comes to the maintenance. You have to change the water dish once or twice a week. You'll have to feed them once every week, every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on how big the animal is or what age it is. You'll have to clean the enclosure. You'll have to maintain the plants if you have a bioactive substrate, make sure the isopods and springtails are doing okay. If you don't have a bioactive substrate, you'll have to think about the maintenance you'll have to do when it comes to changing your substrate every month or a couple months or however often. You'll have to think about taking the poop out of the enclosure, making upgrades to the enclosure. I do recommend looking at different resources, different care guides for your specific snake. I'm making just an overall king snake care guide because I have so many of them. And I will say, I was going back and forth on whether or not I should make a specific care guide for each king snake that I have, but many of them are pretty similar. You'll definitely want to research other care guides that are also specific to your specific animal. Just because these are all king snakes doesn't mean they have the same care requirement. If you're looking for recommendations for which king snake to get, honestly, that's really difficult for me because I find all of them to be very interesting, but my Mexican black king snake has never tried to bite me once, and it's very handleable. And it's similar in that way to my Pueblo milk snake, who has also never tried to bite me in 2 or 3 years. Very handleable, eats really well. So these are two that I would highly recommend, the Mexican black king snake and the Pueblo milk snake. My Florida king and my Cali king are very cool as well, like I said, but they might try to bite you. Alright, so that's a lot of my thoughts on king snakes and how you should take care of them. If you guys have any thoughts, let me know in the comments. Please like this video and please subscribe. If you have anything to add about how to take care of a king snake, there are so many things that I could talk about today. I just talked about a few, to be honest. But if you have anything to add, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.